In the case of a balloon, you've all witnessed this. You have a balloon that's been inflated, sitting around the room for a while. You stick a pin in it, and it breaks into multiple pieces. What happens when that rubber that has been stretched quite a bit and then cooled, and then it relaxes instantaneously, it gets so cold that the rubber's brittle and it breaks into 2 or 3 pieces. Notice that next time. A rubber band's pretty interesting. When you stretch it and hold it to your lip, that's sensitive to heat, stretch it real quick, it feels warm. Now if you stretch it and hold it there a minute and cool it off, let air run across it and cool it off, and then release it and then touch it to your lip real quick, it's cold. The bigger the rubber band, the more dramatic this is. I'm using 3 little rubber bands here. But get yourself a big rubber band, stretch it to its limit, and feel the warmth, cool it off, and then you can feel the coolness. You could theoretically, not practically, but theoretically, have many, many thousands of rubber bands. You stretch them outside, cool them off, bring them inside, relax them, blow air across the cold rubber bands, take them outside, stretch them again. That could be a refrigeration cycle in itself. When I was in high school, I went to these people's house. They were operating a business out of their house, and I went to pick up something. And I see them both sitting in the kitchen, sweating like crazy. They had the refrigerator door open, thinking that was going to cool them off. And what they didn't realize is that the refrigerator, this setup was heating up the room. The power was coming in from the electrical cord, maybe 500 or 600 watts to run the compressor, and every bit of that ends up in heat in the room. Yes, the refrigeration system does its job. It takes heat from inside the refrigerator and pumps it outside, but it pumps out more heat than it cools off because of the incoming power. So what they didn't know is that they were heating the room. They were not cooling it. I want to mention friction. Now friction is interesting, and you might have studied it, might not have. There's 2 kinds of friction, static friction and dynamic friction. Static friction is more powerful than dynamic friction, meaning once you get a box sliding across the floor, once it's sliding, it's easier to push. So static friction holds tight until it slips, and then you go into dynamic friction. Static friction is a variable. Now, a lot of you teachers will dispute that, but let me explain. If this table were sitting on a smooth floor and I push on it 1 pound of force, the table wouldn't move. Why didn't it move? Because the frictional forces are pushing back at me the exact amount I'm pushing. So if I push 1 pound, the frictional force is pushing back at me 1 pound, and everything is static. If I push 2 pounds and the table still does not move, then the static friction is 2 pounds. So therefore, static friction is a variable. It's only as strong as it's needed. Now, in the case of a car, when the car is going down the road, the only connection between you and the roadway are 4 patches of rubber that are rolling and continuously sitting on the pavement. You're operating with static friction there because nothing's sliding, it's just rolling and sticking to the pavement. When you apply the brakes, everything hangs on, the wheels are still turning, but when you apply enough brakes, they break loose and start skidding. Then you go into dynamic friction and you don't stop very well, and you can't possibly steer because all you have are 2 patches under the 2 front tires that are sliding. Whether you turn them left or right, the car still goes forward. The beauty of anti-lock brakes, they have a system on each wheel that can tell when the wheel is moving and how fast it's moving. And when you apply the brakes and get past the maximum point of static friction where the pad of rubber wants to slip on the roadway, it senses the stoppage of the wheels and releases the brake momentarily, so it starts rolling again. Then you're operating in static friction again until such time it slides again, and it repeats that. It pulsates. You have the pedal, you keep the pressure on the pedal, and the system pulsates the brakes to keep you in static friction. And since this allows the wheels to roll, you have steering ability. It's so much safer. I would not recommend driving a car, especially up north on the slick roads, without anti-lock brakes. I want to mention, describe how a fuel injection system works on a car. All cars are fuel injected now. They all, in years past, used carburetor. Carburetor was a very simple device. It used aspiration. It was a bowl of fuel with tubes in it. The tubes came up into a venturi where the air was passing across it, and it would suck a little bit of fuel out and get in the airstream, and you would have an air-fuel mixture. When the piston went down, it would suck this air across these tubes, suck in the air-fuel mixture, compress it, the spark plug would fire, you'd have the power stroke, then it would push out the exhaust, suck in another charge of a fuel-air mixture. That worked fine until we had to meet strict emissions laws, fuel economy requirements, and maintain good drivability. So we went to a fuel injection system where we have a constant pressure of fuel coming from the tank into an injector. They have two kinds. You can inject it into the cylinder or into the throttle body. Most things use the throttle body injection system. It's simpler, uses less injectors. So we put a pump in the fuel tank. It runs constantly. It runs up through a pressure regulator, gives you a constant pressure source of fuel, and what fuel it does not use, it runs back into the tank. What's in the tank is interesting, but kind of complicated, and I won't explain it. The electronics is what supplies the fuel. It gives it a pulse width on the fuel injector. A long pulse width gives a lot of fuel. A short pulse width gives a little bit of fuel. How does the system know how much fuel to give it? It measures the air going into the system, and the way it does that, they use a MAP sensor, MAP, manifold absolute pressure. It senses how much pressure is in the manifold. It's usually below atmospheric because the engine is sucking air in. If the MAP pressure is very high, that means your throttle blade is not letting much air in, so the engine is sucking a large vacuum in there. The system measures that high vacuum, knows it just has to put a little bit of fuel in, and it does. The minute you open the throttle, you dump air into the manifold, that MAP pressure goes up. The electronics sense that, it dumps fuel in, and off you go. And that's how it is. And they have sensors to measure the throttle blade position and a lot of safety features to make sure nothing wrong goes on, such that if you have an accident and there's a fuel leak, the system senses that and shuts off the pump. Now, in the case of steam, steam could be a refrigerant, air can be a refrigerant, water vapor. We'll get into refrigerants in a minute. But when you boil water on the stove, you add heat to it. This heat that you add to it raises the temperature to the point where it's at 212, it starts boiling into vapor. And the vapor leaves the pot. If that hits your hand, it's hot for two reasons. It has sensible heat. The steam is hot. The steam is certainly 212 or something less than that because it's cooling off. But when the steam condenses on your hand and turns back into water, it gives up the heat, that latent heat that it took to turn it into steam. Now once it turns back to water, it puts that heat into your hand. That's why steam is so hot. Now, for those of you who might already know something about refrigeration, the refrigerant cycle can be described on what we call a pH chart: pressure and enthalpy. This is a measure of heat. This is pressure. And as I said, you have a low pressure side and a high pressure side. This is a wet region. Over here, the refrigerant is liquid. Over here, it is gas. And an isotherm I've drawn three isotherms on here. Isotherm is a constant temperature line. Comes down, goes across, and goes down. Those are three isotherms. Now, we take the refrigerant from the low pressure side, pump it up to the high pressure side. You can see, since it's crossing the isotherms, it's getting hotter. So it's hot. We then put it through the condenser in this direction. This is where it rejects heat. We dump the heat outside. It comes down. It gets wet. Wetter and wetter here. Then we expand it down to the low pressure. That's in the expansion valve or capillary tubes. Then we run it in the evaporator in this direction. That's when it absorbs heat. We have that part inside the house or inside the car, and we get the cool air from it from that. As it goes across, it becomes more gaseous. Then it gets out here, and it's all gas, and we pump it up again. That's the refrigeration cycle on a pH chart. Maybe a little heavy for some of you, but when you get into refrigeration, you'll know what a pH chart is, and the whole subject's quite interesting.